ladies and gentlemen, we are in the rainforest. Now this rainforest you're looking at was originally modeled off of a northern hemisphere rainforest, and what you see in here is just under 100 species of plants. Now the current plant water research going on in here is ongoing research and has been going on since Columbia was here, Columbia University out of New York. And that started with two questions. Now the first question that was simply asked in here was, where are the plants getting their water from? So they're either getting water from an aquifer or river source, which is simulated by pipes buried 16 feet below the soil, or they're getting water from rain, which we have an irrigation system above that does just that. Now the scientists have added a hydrogen tracer to the river water. That way they can determine which source the plants are getting their water from. Now before I give you details on that, question number 2 is simply yes or no. They ask, does a drought affect where the plants get their water from? And the answer is yes. Now what they've observed over a period of time is when both rain and river water are available in here, most of the plants have been observed going for the rainwater. Then during a time of drought, which is typically 2 months long at a time, they don't allow any rain in here. And during that period of time, those same plants have been observed changing and going for the river water instead. Now, a couple of physical things that have been observed during a time of drought. One is a loss of a lot of leaves in here. So plants start dropping leaves, a lot of leaves, as a mechanism to reduce moisture loss. Now this down here on the other side of the railing from you folks, this is our ocean, which started out as a Caribbean tropical ocean. Up until about a month ago, this was had a range of temperature of 72 to 75 degrees. Now what lives in this ocean right now is 8 species of life. 4 species of vertebrates or fish, and 4 species of invertebrates. We have snails, crabs, urchins, and featherworms are what live in there right now. The noise you keep hearing, and I do a lot of field trips, and so little kids come through the door over here that you came through, and they hear this noise, and they all look at me, and the question is, what kind of animal am I hearing? And then adults joke around with me a lot and say, what kind of dinosaur is that you have here? So it does sound a lot like a Jurassic Park in here, doesn't it? Now that noise you're hearing is actually coming from inside that wall there on the right hand side of the ocean. And it's not an animal, it's a machine. You're hearing a vacuum chamber or wave machine. And so when you hear that noise, if you're looking at where the wall and water meet, you'll notice it does produce a little wave. A small one, but a wave. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking at here, this is a science experiment being conducted by a group of high school students. Well, and it was started by a group of high school students from the Sonoran Science Academy in Tucson. These students got a research grant through the U of A, and it's referred to as a green fund, and it's for aquaponics. Now, aquaponics, if you're not familiar with that, that's simply fish feeding plants. This big 500-gallon tank in the very back is full of fish. It's got a bunch of koi in there. In fact, there's 23 koi in there, and the biggest ones are about 7 or 8 inches long. And the water you see here flowing downhill, which is stair-stepping down by gravity, is carrying the waste away from the fish, or the waste from the fish, which is nutrients for the plants you see there. And the substrate or soil in these 4 containers is not regular soil, it's all lava rock. And so the porous nature of this rock allows the water flow to flow right on through. But as that water flows through there, that rock gathers and accumulates the waste from the fish, which is obviously feeding the plants. So, and then by the time the water reaches that 5-gallon bucket down in the very front corner there is a small fountain pump which simply pumps the water back around to the fish again. Now, what this has been here for about 7 months now. And what these students did for the first 4 months was they compared growth of these plants in the aquaponic system versus plants in this container down here on the ground. They referred to as geoponics, regular farm soil. And during the first 4 months, these top 2 containers and this container here had nothing but strawberry plants. And what was observed during that period of time was 2 separate systems, both with healthy strawberry plants and lots of strawberry production. But the aquaponic system simply got there much faster. Now, when you look around this room here, you see these openings. And these openings are ventilation shaft openings coming up from the basement or the technosphere. And that's what the biosphere called, the basement. They called it the technosphere simply because that's where the technology is that controls the climate here in Biosphere 2. Now, what's down here are the machines that we use to control the environment inside Biosphere 2. Now, this machine behind you, just from this side of the corner behind you right here, all the way down to this first light right here, that is one large air handler or heat exchanger. These are actually very common machines. They're very efficient in heating or cooling large buildings or spaces. Now, every one of them have 3 sets of pipe running in and out of the side, and if you see, they're labeled with 3 kinds of water, and that's for 3 kinds of air. Now, and like I mentioned, we can raise or lower the temperature and or the humidity as well. Now, whatever water is being used, that water does run in a closed system. So as this water runs through a bunch of little coils and pipes, very similar to a very large radiator system in a car. Fans draw air through past those coils, and on the other side in that wind tunnel that was very dead in there right now, would have a very strong breeze blowing out that side over there. And then as that air is drawn through there, these machines not only cool or warm an area, but they also reclaim moisture at the same time. So as that air is drawn through, any kind of humidity or moisture in the air, as it passes through, tends to condense on the outside of those coils. Then as that condensation forms, it drips to the bottom where it's then pumped over into big storage tanks like the ones we just walked past. Up until recently, and my prediction it's going to change, these have not been the #1 consumer of electricity here. The #1 consumer up until, well, even now, as far as I know, is the ocean. Heating that ocean is the biggest drain. In fact, it's been just over half of our annual energy cost to heat that ocean. Drinking water was also collected the same exact way as these air handlers function. But before it became drinking water, it was filtered by reverse osmosis. So if you look, when you're walking past these tanks, every now and then you'll see a tank that says RO on it. That would be reverse osmosis water. Called the South Lung Inner Chamber. We have 2 of these. Now, what you're looking at directly overhead, this material above us is a rubber synthetic diaphragm. It's very strong, very durable, but also very flexible. Its flexibility allows the movement of this big disc in the middle to move up and down. Now, this disc in the middle here, this huge disc, is made of steel, and it's extremely heavy. It weighs just short of 16 tons. This diaphragm directly overhead weighs another 4 tons. So we have almost 20 tons of weight pushing down on the atmosphere in here. And the atmosphere is what is holding it up. Okay? So the engineers and designers, yeah, it's kind of hard to swallow, right? Mm-hmm. The engineers and designers in here, or that built this, they referred to this chamber as a variable air volume chamber. This was built because of an understanding of air behavior with temperature change. Now, simply put, because as air molecules warm up, they expand. They take up more volume or space. And as those air molecules cool, they condense and take up less space. So the engineers knew if we sealed the biosphere up completely without anywhere for that expansion and condensing to occur with temperature change, they would either blow out windows or even implode windows. And so to keep that from happening, they built this. Because DuPont said, when they designed this and built the diaphragm, I'm sure most of you have figured it out, rubber synthetic diaphragm, the sun would destroy that. So it's simply to protect the top side. That is the energy center. Now the energy center is where the biospherians had their power generated for them while they were sealed inside. And so they did not have access to that building. And so they were dependent on people outside the system to generate and maintain their power for them. And that was done with natural gas. So they had the El Paso natural gas line come into the building, and from there they heated boilers. Steam from the boilers spun turbines which generated electricity, and then they also had diesel backup generators in case the power went down. And we still use those backup generators today if our power goes down, which is not very often. And the idea is to slowly add more and more solar as the technology and the cost improves. Now the biospherians did look into solar power back when they were building and getting ready to do their experiments, but what they discovered was about $25 million and for 2 years of solar energy was what it was going to cost them. And the private financiers at that time were like, no, it doesn't fit the budget. None of the scientists here ever thought there was any kind of failure. If you're a scientist and you know the scientific process, well, I taught elementary ed for 12 years, and what I used to tell my students was, the only time you fail in science is when you give up. Now, the main private financer was a gentleman named Edward Bass, and he's a billionaire out of Texas, a philanthropist. Does really good things with his money. And he spent $150 million to build this facility here. And he's still part of our group today. We're still getting money from him. He's amazing. But he came forward at the end of, the comment was made during the first 2-year mission. I didn't realize they were going to be spending so much time farming. And I'm not quoting him, I'm just kind of paraphrasing it. But during the second mission, that mission was ended early because the amount of time that they were spending on farming and maintenance. So they were spending almost all of their energy and time on survival in here. And so he came forward, he said, look, the private financiers and I have been discussing this. We feel we've learned everything we can from a sealed experiment. So what we want to do is we want to open this up, and for our money, we want other types of research as well. Things that they thought they were going to get more of, but didn't get quite as much of.
Whew, another hill. So I wanted to talk about this before I forgot. So he said there were social issues. Nobody could decide who's in charge. They were fighting over food. And not only were they growing plants for themselves, they were growing plants for their animals. So they did have pork and chicken and other animals that were for food, but they were also having to grow the food for the animals. And so they felt like it was a failure. Was Edward Bass, the one who funded it, thought it was a failure because he didn't think that they would be spending that much time farming. But they were constantly farming to keep the animals alive, to feed themselves. And what ended up happening was they miscalculated as far as like being able to breed the animals so that they would continue to have food. They had enough protein from those animals to eat meat once a week. And before the end of the 2 years, they'd eaten all the animals. And so when the scientists came out, they were really, really hungry. And the other thing that started to happen was that the CO2 went up, the oxygen went down, and they had to pump oxygen into the building to continue the experiment. So it wasn't a failure, but I have to kind of wonder what it would have been like if they'd had a couple farmers on that team instead of a whole bunch of scientists. Because any farmer could have told you that if you're growing food for yourself as well as food for your own animals, and you don't hold on to your breeding stock, you're not going to be eating meat anymore, and you're going to be spending all your time growing food. So I think it's amazing. The other thing is that they didn't test the glass before they put it on, and the only thing that the scientists were short on, deficient in, when they came out of the biosphere was vitamin D. Turns out the glass blocked 90, did it say 99? I think they said it was 99% of the UV rays. So even though they were inside a greenhouse, they weren't getting any vitamin D. So that was hugely interesting. Kind of gives an end of days scenario, a prepper scenario, some credence, because when it comes down to even really, really brilliant people, it does come down to the lowest common denominator, which is survival. Even though you're doing it for a cranial reason, which is they wanted to know if they could establish a civilization on another planet with a sealed envelope system. When it came down to it and they were hungry, they started to fight amongst each other. There wasn't enough food to go around, and they didn't have the presence of mind to save their livestock. And they didn't have the presence of mind to be able to work on something besides food production, even though they were there to be researchers. It all came down to who was hungry, and also leadership. There wasn't any hierarchy. Everybody went in as equals. And even though they'd had extensive testing to see if they could handle being in these small spaces together, and then it came down to who's boss and whose banana is that. So, really interesting. Great interview. Hope you enjoyed it.